Welcome, Lisa. Thank you for being willing to hop on here and show the first interview, actually, that I'll probably be releasing on the page or the group, technically. I'm just wondering if you could tell me about yourself and your diabetes story in your family, about how it all started.
My name is Lisa Seitles, and my son Casey has type 1 diabetes. We have 4 children, my husband Sam and I, and Casey is our second son. So we have our son Jaden, who's 10, Casey, who just turned 9, Ashton, who's 6, and Sora, who is 4. We are a very busy family, and we also own a preschool and a summer camp. When Casey was diagnosed, it was extremely traumatic because, of course, like many families, we were not expecting this whatsoever. It does not really run in our family, and I know, as someone who's such a huge advocate, that 93% of families who get it don't have a history of T1. But that's another reason of why I spread awareness, because I did not know that at the time either. Casey started showing symptoms of type 1 before we knew that. I just kept questioning, why is he so tired? Why is he so moody? Why doesn't he want to participate in a play date he's waited to have for 2 months? Why does he have scratches on his face that won't heal? Usually kids heal pretty fast. Why is he wetting the bed? The wetting the bed one was confusing for me at first, because my boys, they love to bunk together. And I just thought one day it was this one wetting the bed. The next day it must have been the other one. The next day, the third one, until I separated them out one day to their own beds. And I said, I need to figure this out. Who's wetting the bed? And that's when I realized it was Casey. And it was really concerning because it was a lot of wetting the bed. It was just soaking wet. And I just was confused by that. He also started asking to drink a lot of milk. And at the time, I only found this out later, apparently at school, he was drinking 3 huge thermoses of water a day. And I did not know that at the time. And one day he walks into the living room, and I look up, and I just think he looks so gaunt. I just can't believe it. And I take a picture of him and I send it to my family, and I say, guys, do you think he looks gaunt? And everyone's like, no, he must just be getting taller. He must be a growth spurt. And another one of those things about type 1 that misdiagnoses, growth spurts. Then it became extremely concerning when he came down to our school, and one of my staff said he just wanted to go lay on the couch. And I was like, that's strange. His best friend is here. He loves school. And so I took him upstairs with me, and I said, we'll just do your work together. Maybe you didn't sleep well. And as I was doing his work with him, he just closed his eyes and went to sleep. And I was like, oh boy, he must really have not slept well last night. I let him take a nap, and he looked, his cheeks were rosy, his eyes were glassy. And I was just like, again, and I took a picture, and I'm like, this seems odd. I'm like questioning it. And while he was sleeping, I Googled his symptoms. I just started putting like 10 different symptoms into Google, and up came type 1. And the funny thing about this is I grew up with a close family friend who has type 1. And when type 1 popped up on the screen, I thought, that can't be right. And I re-Googled, and then I got urinary tract infection. And I was like, that doesn't sound right either. Then I said to my husband, let's just take him in, as soon as possible. We had to get a COVID-19 shot that day, and they were very hard at that time to schedule. We had a friend lined up to watch the kids. And when he woke up from that nap, he seemed almost like nothing had ever bothered him. He seemed energetic again. He must have just not slept well. I told my friend when we dropped him off, he took a nap today. He seemed tired, but he seems okay now. Just keep an eye on him. And she happens to have type 1 diabetes. When we pick him up, my husband gets in the car, and he turns to me and says, just not even thinking or even knowing I Googled type 1 earlier in the day, because I never told anybody, thinking it was nothing. he says, she thinks Casey has diabetes. And as soon as he said that, all alarm bells went off in my body and my mind. And I called my mom, who's been not just with her friend who lives with type 1, but who has been writing about diabetes for 10 years. And I said, I'm terribly afraid he could be in diabetic ketoacidosis.
Mm.
What should I do? And she said, take him back and have your friend test his blood sugar. I drove him back and she tested his blood sugar. I just remember her monitor flashing. She grabbed my arm. She looked at me. Her eyes were just terror. And she says, Lisa, this is not good. And in that minute, I burst out in tears. And his
Oh.
blood sugar, she was higher than she'd ever seen it. It was 676. And she said he needs to go to the emergency room. And I was just crying the whole ride there. I thought he was going to die. And I kept asking her to reassure me that he would be okay. And she's like, don't worry, they'll take care of him. And from there, the local ER transferred him to CHOP, one of the best hospitals in Philly. And there we spent about 3 days learning about type 1 diabetes. It was very overwhelming. And I just was still very traumatized. And when they discharged us, I just felt like I had been left on my own with a life-threatening disease for my child with very little knowledge gained. And it was that in itself was also traumatic, honestly. A few months after that, I realized that I had grown up with someone around often that had type 1 and had zero clue what his life was like with type 1 until my son was diagnosed. And that's when I sat down, wrote my first article from start to finish, submitted it to the newspaper, and said, you don't have to accept this, but I plan to keep writing about type 1 diabetes to spread awareness and help others. And here's my first article. And she accepted it. And I am 32 articles later, 3 years
Oh.
in, writing about type 1 diabetes for free to help other people. And I'll stop there and let you ask some more questions, but that was his story and sort of how it started me off on becoming a huge advocate.
Yes, that's amazing. I'm just out of curiosity, from the start of its symptoms until you realized what it was, how long was that time span?
I want to say a little thing here or there. I think the first time I thought like, oh, he looks like he's losing a little baby fat. That was probably a couple months prior. Nothing dramatic. Not like the day he walked in and I was like, oh my gosh, he's gaunt. It just very slight. That's and then him being a picky eater. When now I look back at the picky eating and think, was his blood sugar low? Is that why he was asking for something sweet, thankfully, or something? That those things combined, I would say probably a safe guess would be a couple months. The more serious symptoms, like the bedwetting, and then it got like to like the drinking and all of that, I would say about 2 weeks. And then the last 2 to 3 days more like what is going on. And then the day he went to like me really like Googling and being like, what the heck? What are these symptoms? Do they mean anything? It was just so odd. And like many families, you look at all these symptoms and there's always a reason. Oh, he's thirsty. Well, he just ran around outside. Oh, he's wetting the bed. He must have drunk too much before bedtime. Oh, he's tired. He missed some sleep last. Always a reason you can give yourself for these symptoms. And that's why in part it's always missed until it's like almost too late.
Once you get to that last 2 weeks, there's a rapid transition. In your case, it was 2 weeks, but for some people, it all happens in 1 or 2 days. I was more like your son. When I looked back, it was a few months for me. And then just to relate it to my experience, I was in a honeymoon phase for maybe 10 months after that. Did you have a honeymoon phase with
So that's
Kate?
one thing that people talk about that I cannot relate to, because by the time Casey was diagnosed, it seemed like he had just zero insulin left in his body. And
Mm-hmm.
so I just, when people talk about that, it's like almost a mystery to me because we didn't experience that at all.
No, and all it really was your body, my body was still adjusting a bit to the
Yeah.
amount of carbohydrates, and I was able to bring my insulin levels down pretty low by changing my diet, which is very different as an adult. I was a young adult.
How old were you
I was
when
21.
that's about the age that our close family friend was diagnosed? I think he was two.
It's
Yeah.
back then people told me that was rare. That was 1991, 92 was the year I got diagnosed. But it's much more common because I mean, just based on my own experience, I've met a lot of people who it was the end of their teens, early 20s. Yeah.
Oh, you here, the friend who saved his life, also in her 20s.
Raising a child with this is so different. And I remember at the time thinking, I know how I feel. And if I want to, at first I wanted to know what hypoglycemia felt like, but it was me. But when it's a child and you can't feel what they're feeling, you've got blinders on and you just want to keep everything under control. I can't imagine how much more stressful that would be. And I'm sure, just like all parents say, I'd rather take it any day off my kids' shoulders. Yeah.
Yes. From day one, we've always told Casey that we would rather live with this than him. And it is truly terrifying, especially at the beginning when you don't have a lot of knowledge yet about it. And over 3 years, I feel that I've seen my son's life threatened by type 1 multiple times. And how often does a parent have to see their child have their life threatened? And it does take a huge toll. Of course, we worry a lot, and some experiences we've gone through have been huge learning lessons for us. We've made mistakes, just like I'm sure other parents have, and
Everybody.
we feel guilty, and then we try to move past it. And but all in all, I always tell people, having a child with type 1 diabetes, from my experiences in life thus far, is going to be the most difficult thing I will ever do in my life, is have that, because I love him with all my heart and I don't ever want anything to happen to him.
Yes. What were the hardest changes you had to make as far as the family habits and routines, like not getting into the insulin and the medical technical stuff, but how did it affect your family routines and getting your kids to activities in the everyday part of life?
That's a good question. Everything takes longer because you have to pre-plan where you're going and what activity Casey is doing, how that's going to affect him. Just before I leave the house, every single time I open his diabetes kit in his bag, and I make sure I am not missing a single item. I go through it one by one and check that everything's there. If something's missing, I put it back in. That's step one. If we're going somewhere on a lot more long-term basis, like a vacation, I overpack his supplies because I've sometimes gone through 3 sensors in 2 hours because of malfunctions, or one of his brothers will jump on him and the Dexcom flies off, or I have seen enough to know I need to have multiple backup supplies. If we're on a long car ride or going on vacation, I always keep things both in the car and at the hotel or house we're staying at, so that if we do go to a park and his Dexcom flies off, it may not be on my body necessarily, but it'll be in the parking lot and I will go and be able to get it. I'm always thinking what to have on hand. Second thing is how it's affecting him. Water parks, that's always more challenging. Usually his blood sugar is going to at some point drop low. We also have to pack the waterproof phone cases. Usually if it's something like whitewater rafting, we got to pack a waterproof book bag. We have to pack the waterproof tape that goes around his arm for the Dexcom, and decide, depending on what the activity is, if he should even keep his pump on. Water activity, we generally take it off. So then we have to monitor him a lot more with making sure he comes back to his phone sooner, so we get a signal again, or doing a finger poke. These things, of course, take time, especially if there's a problem and we have to end up changing his pump. We've changed his pump in the car and then pretty much anywhere, because like that's life. You're on the road, you're doing this and that, and something comes up, or you suddenly realize he's out of insulin. And so you just always have to be prepared. And our other kids, they're very empathetic and very patient about all of this, because they realize that their brother's life is at stake without all of this preparation and attention that he gets. Actually, one of my articles was an interview of his 3 siblings
Oh, I
to
love it.
what perspective was, and it was very sweet. They all have an understanding that this is something serious, and they want the best for him. Otherwise, family dynamic wise, pretty much as soon as Casey was diagnosed, I'm usually just to feel that I'm in control of the situation, especially in a disease like type 1 diabetes, where you really have not so much control over it to begin with. A take charge person, like I'll change the Dexcom, I'll change the pump, I'll order the diabetes supplies, etc. But I knew as soon as he was diagnosed that if I did not purge my husband to also be a part in all of this, and not just be the take charge person and I'll handle it, don't worry, that would be a mistake. And so from the very start, my husband understanding this as well, we have always tried to divide the work to keep Casey safe, just to help each other from preventing burnout, etc. And also so that the other one always has knowledge of what to do. God forbid something happens to one of us. One of us is out for the night with friends and something happens, the other one knows what to do. We take turns changing his pump site, his Dexcom, just things like that. It's not like perfectly even Steven. Of course, if I'm with Casey and he runs out of insulin, I'm going to change it, even if I did it last time. But it just is something I advise to couples who are married, that they both take equal part in helping their child, not just for their child's sake, but also for their marriage and themselves. It's just a good thing to keep in mind.
I like that a lot, and it makes so much sense. And I think there's an ownership that comes with it, sharing, feeling part of it. There's something about feeling part of it, even in my relationship with my husband, because when I was diagnosed, we were dating, but he was involved from the start, and it really has been a lifesaver, especially when things aren't going so well, to have someone who is paying attention and noticing what there's more involvement with him, even as to, well, maybe you should try this, or maybe you missed that. And we also now have my mom, who got type 1 diabetes at the age of 72 or 3.
Wow, I've heard of people getting it at that age.
And
Yes.
she needs guidance. She's now 81. I think she'll be 82 in April. So she does need help now, because that's a short span of part of her life, and she's now having cognitive difficulties. But it's nice that my husband knows what to do too. We always talk to the care worker, and it's nice to have that hand in it, for sure.
Yes. And another thing I would say is, if you can try to explain it to your family and even your friends in a way that they truly understand, that can only help you all the more, the way you're saying. So, my mother has been extremely involved in helping care for Casey in just numerous ways. One of my articles was actually about her, because she just stands out as the best grandma in the world. And she's like, before we even had a babysitter, that of course we had to find one now who would be willing to work with type 1 and understand the dangers of it. And before we found, he would come him for us so that we could go out once in a while. And now we do have a wonderful babysitter that watches him. She's fantastic, and she really puts her heart and soul into understanding the disease. And that's another thing, like that doesn't come immediately for a lot of people to find someone like that, because it does require a willingness to take that on, and then like obviously some training to understand exactly what this disease entails, because a lot is so behind the scenes that people look at a healthy person and they just don't understand what exactly all that type 1 entails. Finding support in multiple different ways is very valuable, and I would encourage people to definitely try their best to get that.
How hard is it to let go and go out? And is it
So
nerve-wracking?
it has been, obviously, with my mom, and then seeing our babysitter manage it so well, we have peace of mind with them. But it is hard when you go out. Initially, we didn't go out very far. We would go to a restaurant 5 or 10 minutes from the house, just in case. Now we'll venture out more like 30 minutes, because we see that the people we're entrusting him with, they understand. But it is still hard. Eventually he left our school and he went to the public school, and that was a whole nother thing. You want to make sure that the people he's with really understand, because I know what it's like to be on the other side. I grew up with someone who has type 1 and I did not get it. So I feel like here's a healthy looking kid walking around, and all the stigma, thinking type 1 is type 2, and just a lot of the misconceptions out there, even the misconception of people thinking like to do the opposite, like, oh, he's high, that's when you give sugar, or like there's just so many misconceptions that I worry, is the people he is with, do they really understand? And sometimes I find that they may not, and that's when it's very hard for us as full-time working parents to have that worry. We just want to know that if he's somewhere, that all eyes are on him at all times, because he's just a young kid, and he's very smart, so he does tend to give the impression that he has it all handled. But I've seen stories of college children die from people who thought, that were watching them like on overseas trips or whatever, thinking they had it all handled. And
Mhm.
and that's where like people really don't understand the seriousness of the disease. And so that's been hard. We manage it. We keep in touch with staff, the nurse staff, during the day as needed. And Casey, like I said, he wanted to basically take control over type 1 and learn how to do things pretty much from the start. I think it gave him more sense of control over what was happening to him.
Mhm.
So he already counts carbs. He can input them into his pump. He's learning like how to input his blood sugar if the pump doesn't register it, if it goes over 400.